a great year for the City Club. We were able to help out some other organizations along the way, and I know many of you contributed financially to these events, and I want to thank you. But you may recall in January, one of our City Club members, David Axelrod, headlined a breakfast up at Misericordia, and the City Club was able to shine the light on those with special needs and raise awareness. In July, two of our City Club members, Mayor Richard Daley and Bill Gaynor, asked the City Club to help out on the annual State of the City luncheon. And we did lend a hand, and the attendance was the largest in the history of the City of Chicago for any State of the City address. And then in September, 4 of our City Club members, Governor Quinn, Mayor Daley, Susan Nickel, Skinny Sheehan, asked the City Club to help out in connection with special children's charities and the Special Olympics. And so people got to hear from the Governor, Mayor Daley, and Chris Kennedy about the contributions of Supreme Court Justice Ann Burke, also a City Club member, and honored the life of Eunice Kennedy. Yesterday, City Club Chairman Tom Roser and Board Member Anthony Cole hosted a breakfast right here with Governor Quinn to help out the Haymarket Center. So I want to thank you all, every one of the City Club members. We're a small group, we're just over 1,000 people, but we're mighty. So thank you for helping your neighbor and for your civic commitment. So give yourselves a round of applause. Now, just a few quick folks I want to acknowledge. First of all, the governor couldn't be here, but he sent his chief operating officer, Jack Lavin. Jack, thank you very much for being with us. You can't run an organization like this and not have great corporate support. For years and years, the 16 years I've been president, first among equals has been Commonwealth Edison and Exelon. We have with us today the president of ComEd, Ann Promisori. Ann, thanks for being with us today. We have the head of McPeer, Juan Ochoa. Juan, thank you for being with us today. And I know that several of the sometimes folks are going to be acknowledged by the leadership, but there's one person who's been a great friend of the City Club and a great friend of mine and our family for many, many years. I always say she's Illinois' most powerful columnist, Michael Sneed. Michael, thank you for being with us today. The Chicago Teacher Union President, Marilyn Stewart. Marilyn, thank you very much for being with us today. I mentioned ComEd, but we also have American Airlines, Bill Hood, and United, Margaret Houlihan. Thank you very much. Senior Vice President, Advertising, Chicago Sun-Times, Barbara Sampson. Barbara, where are you? Oh, Barbara, stand up. These people should see you. Maybe they'll buy an ad. He's a mayor, and he's also Cook County Commissioner, our good friend, Pete Silvestri. Your Honor, thank you. There we go, Pete. Thank you. We always say there's an international visitor. He's the Vice President of Village President of Matson, Andre Ashmore. Andre, where are you? Thank you very much for being with us. Senator Dan Cronin. Dan, thank you for being with us. State Representative Jay Hoffman, thank you. And our good friend, he served as Cook County Assessor, Tom Tully. Thomas, thank you for being with us. Judge Bellard reminded me, Judge Tom Hogan and Judge Jack Callahan. Thank you for being with us. Great City Club member and really a freedom fighter when it comes to the First Amendment. Great friend of the City Club, Christy Hefner. Christy, thanks for being with us. And her spouse, Billy Maravich. Senator, thank you for being with us. Ed, the show goes on. Showtime. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. What we're going to do right now is to introduce one of our speakers, and we'll then introduce the other two speakers. Okay. We have a late arrival here. You know how they have this bulletin comes across the bottom of your TV screen in yellow? And Jay just informed me that we'd like to take a moment to introduce one of the great City Club members, a legendary person in Chicago history, Chicago political history, and business history, Tom Donovan. And now I have the pleasure of introducing one of the great Chicago White Sox fans and supporters, who also happens to be the chairman and chief executive officer of Mesero Financial since 1994, and who is the Sun-Times Media Holdings chairman, in addition to which Jim Tyree has been named Person of the Year by the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. He serves on more than 50 corporate, civic, and not-for-profit boards of directors. For the last 10 years, he has been chairman of the board of the City Colleges of Chicago, 7 colleges and 110,000 students. Jim holds a bachelor's and a master's degree from Illinois State University, and he is the chairman of the Sun-Times Media, which is the only newspaper in town that gives those of us who are crossword puzzle fanatics 2 crossword puzzles every day. Jim, thank you.
Thank you so much. I was walking over here and I heard the results of an informal survey, and I just want to check to see if it's formal or not. I, in this informal survey, heard that every single member, all 1,000 of them, Jay, every single member read the Sun-Times. Is that right? All right, here's a tougher one. Any City Club member does not read the Sun-Times? Okay. What we do have here, and Jeremy and John have them with you, should you want another subscription, we have cards here, and please feel free to grab one. I'll have them coming out of my pockets, and so many other folks here. And if you'd like to place an ad, Barbara Swanson is certainly here. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the entire City Club for having us here. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, but it's even more of a pleasure for me to be here with Jeremy Halbreich and John Barron. John you might know well, and Jeremy you're going to get to know real well as time goes by. I'm going to start off our conversation, and if my conversations over the last 4 or 5 months have been typical, some of the questions you might want to know is why and how. And I'm going to try to address each of those and then follow up with a couple other comments. But let me first start off by saying, as I was introduced, my day job is Mesero Financial. And I am going to retain my day job, and I love it. I've been there every day of almost 30 years. And this is a job that I took on, number one, because it's a strong business opportunity. And so that's getting on to the why. There's basically 3 reasons why. And they all gather around the concept of a great business opportunity. Now, many folks have come up to me over the last few months and said, Jim, thanks. Thanks. It's really terrific. You're doing a great thing for the civic pride of Chicago and keeping us, in good shape as a 2-newspaper town. And I'm interested in that. I really am. But only as it works in terms of creating a business model that makes sense. It wouldn't make any sense for I and our investor group to come out and preserve the Sun-Times for a few years by putting some money in and doing some fix-it types of things. The concept here is to build a business that will be here for decades. And a business that will serve all of its constituents. A very important one is which are readers. The second one is the communities in which we live in and serve, from the Wisconsin border all the way through Northwest Indiana, and a very big ring around Chicago. I think all of you know by now it's the Sun-Times, as well as 58 other newspapers, 8 other dailies, 51 other weekly newspapers, and many, many free newspapers, and all the websites that go along with it. Serving those communities is very critical. Also serving our employees, the people who work at the Sun-Times, the people who make a living there and have done that so for generations. And fourth, and just as importantly, is to reward the people, the investment group that had the capabilities and the foresight to be able to put this together. So serving those 4 constituencies is really what allows us to serve each and every one of them. So now, why, given that overall framework? In the concept of distressed investing, I've grown up over the last 3 decades in really doing successful distressed investing based on 3 criteria. And all 3 have to be in place, and all 3 have to be in place in a very high quality. First and foremost is some overriding, overarching strength of that organization, whether it's intellectual property, whether it's a methodology, a business methodology, whether it's a brand name or something that is a competitive advantage that poor times can't beat out of the organization. And in the Sun-Times, I think that is very clear and very key, because I believe strongly that the people, the 1,800 people, of which many are involved in creating content, are really spectacular. Whether it's Pioneer Press or Beacon News or Post Tribune or the Southtown, I still call it The Economist from when I delivered it as a kid, but the Southtown Star, and all those newspapers do create great content. I think it's been beaten down a little bit over the years by not having the appropriate investment, because the business model of a newspaper was under strain, not just for the Sun-Times, but for the Tribune and virtually every other newspaper in town. But I believe very strongly, and so does the entire management team, that the quality of content will prevail. That an ability, whether you read the newspaper from back to front, front to back, or middle out, it's the quality of that content that will always be in demand. And the quality of that content is driven by the people who create it. And therefore, we must not only preserve those people who create that content, but invest in it. Many mistakes were made in the newspaper business that basically said that as you were investing, you know, the businesses were successful, 30, 40, 50% margins, and then when you got hit and had to adjust from a business perspective, you adjusted from the cost side without much thought. And the thought was really around, well, let's cut everybody 10%. It got worse, let's cut everybody another 10 or 15%. It got worse, let's cut everybody another 10 or 15%, without a rationalization and innovation involved in delivering that content. And so, from my perspective, to be able to just cut everybody across the board, rather than cutting where you absolutely had to be competitive, and invest in the content of your organization, play to your strengths, newspapers have been reacting in the inappropriate way. And so it is that content that fits my first criteria, overriding strength of a brand and a capability, whether it be the Naperville papers or the Pioneer Press papers or anywhere. It will be local content, high integrity, high quality content will be foremost in our mind. That will serve us extremely well in taking care of those 4 constituencies I just talked about. Second is that in any business situation, you have to develop a turnaround plan, especially when something is in as deep a trouble as this organization was. And by trouble, I don't mean as much just from the normal trouble that everybody has in the newspaper business. We had some extraordinary trouble at the Sun-Times, and that really came from past owners. I don't know too many businesses that have been able to survive without debt, external debt or third-party debt, but that had $600+ million of IRS debt. And that was certainly the case with the Sun-Times. I had the pleasure of looking at this institution back about 6 or 7 years ago when the troubles first started coming out, and I don't know how anybody was going to do anything. Subsequent management teams then went out and tried to find investors or to do other things, and I had conversations with each of John Cruikshank and Michael Cook and Cy Friedheim, the previous folks who led this organization, and to each one of them I had the same counsel. You can't get anything done without bankruptcy, because you're not going to be able to negotiate with the IRS, you're not going to have the ability to do what needs to get done. And so, on March 31st, when bankruptcy was filed, I made a call to a person that was just brought in, Jeremy Halbreich, And we met, and that started the odyssey which brought us here today. And so that turnaround plan, first meeting with a very strong management group that includes Jeremy Halbreich and John Barron and a team that I'll cover in a minute, led us to believe that there was a business model that we could design that would come out of bankruptcy. And ladies and gentlemen, I'll say to you here today, bankruptcy is a beautiful thing. It is an extremely beautiful thing. Now, of course, you know I'm commenting about coming out of it, not going in it. And, you know, it wreaks havoc when you have to go in it. But what it did for the Sun-Times, as it does for many other organizations, it really does allow you to take what might be a 5 or a 10-year or a 15-year process to restructure, reorient, and create a culture of innovation, and you can do it in a matter of months through the pleasures of bankruptcy. And so we were able to take out the assets, acquire the assets that we felt were required and necessary to go forward, to create a new organization. An organization that was free from liabilities of the past, that was free with a lot of the issues that kind of hamstrung us and created a great deal of flexibility, free to be able to use new cash flow, not to solve problems, but to create and utilize for capital expenditures so that we could bring the organization into the digital world. And that is one of the keys. And so when you go through and look at that and have a turnaround plan in terms of weeks and months, not in terms of years, but obviously being prepared for it to be years, that's the number 2 criteria. Now, how did we get to that when no one else did? Well, I do have the blessing of having, obviously a biased opinion, but having a spectacular business in Mesero Financial. And in Mesero Financial, I used 4 of our 6 businesses in a total of about 40 or 50 people, whether it be from our consulting business, which is involved in corporate restructuring, bankruptcies, interim management, due diligence and valuation, whether it be folks from the insurance business that do property and casualty work or benefits work or liability work, whether it be our investment advisory business who took care of the pension plan work and the 401k plan, or whether it be our legal department that helped us, or whether it be a young man, Michael Simon, who I drafted out of the investment banking business to work this day to day. It's having that ethic of hard work, of understanding value we did. And then thirdly, is that the major criteria is that when you go into a distressed situation, you can't be foolish enough to believe in the revelation theory. And you guys know what a revelation is. And in this case, I'd say you can't believe that the people who were responsible for putting it there would all of a sudden get a revelation and be able to change it and develop a new plan. You can use a lot of the same people in blocking and tackling, and there are some great people, and the folks that you now see running the Sun-Times have varying degrees from a few months, and our Vice Chairman and CEO, Jeremy Halbreich, to some that have a long history, like John Barron, who I'm very proud to say has this week been elevated to the general publisher of the Sun-Times and will be responsible for publishing all of our newspapers. And Jeremy will cover a little bit more about John. But also Barbara Swanson, who we affectionately love to call our Chief Revenue Officer, and her team. Kevin King and Fred LeBolt and CFO to be named soon. We're still working through that process. Jim McDonough, our General Counsel, who has guided a lot of different areas. So there is a team of new leadership that will be able to take this organization, I think, to a new level. So a combination of those 3 things, the ability to have a great core strength content, to have a turnaround plan that is efficient and effective and quick, and great leadership are what really make this happen. So the real question is how? I mean, some of you might be wondering, what did you pay for it? How did it all work? Bankruptcy allows you, as some people say, to take the good assets and leave the bad assets behind. So we did use a 363 sale vehicle, which is a bankruptcy code provision that says you can take out good assets, leave bad assets with the state. We did that We raised a significant amount of money, $5 million of which to pay to the estate, assumed $22 million of liabilities, and a strong cash hoard to be able to utilize that cash to continue to develop and grow the business, and in effect, to be able to use the cash to bring the firm into a very strong digital age. And I say that's important because although I don't think this will be soon, because I have 3 kids under 10, but my grandkids are going to be sitting on my knee someday, and they're going to say to me, "Hey, Pops, were you one of the guys who used to chop down trees and mush them up and put ink on them and put out that kind of stuff for us to read?" And I'd say, "Yeah, but that's kind of gone now." Now, let me hesitate to say it's not going to go in the next decade, maybe 2 decades, if we continue reading. But it is going to be a capability that a digital age of high-quality content will survive. People need content, whether it's political or sports or entertainment, and I believe very strongly that the day and age of bloggers will not go away, but people are going to want things other than opinions. And the opinions they want, they get, and so they're going to want factual stories with integrity and with journalistic training and journalistic review. And they are going to want opinions, but they're going to want opinions from people who they know and trust. And I think there's always going to be a key spot for folks like that. So I think that the personalities you see will continue. I think that through the leadership of Jeremy Halbreich, and Jeremy has a very long history in the newspaper business. Jeremy has a long-standing history. I hope everybody will learn about his work in Dallas of really taking a #2 newspaper and not only taking it in #1, but also taking it into the Soul newspaper in Dallas. Has a long history then of being an entrepreneur and developing his own newspaper business, and then was brought into the Sun-Times. And Jeremy and the entire team are the reasons why the Sun-Times will continue to flourish and will continue to win. And without further ado, I'd like to bring Jeremy up, please.
So now the fun part starts. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for hosting us today. Jim, thank you for that introduction. I think for most, if not all of you who know Jim a lot longer than I, however long that may or may not have been in each of your individual cases, it should come as no surprise that Jim and his group of associates at Mesereau didn't just study the Sun-Times as a sort of standalone business and ask the tough questions, but they really got to the core of what news enterprises are about, whether they are predominantly print, magazine or newspaper, broadcast, cable, online, and try to get at the real core of what those enterprises represent and where the real value lies. Because I think while we today have a wonderful business, dramatically improved from where it was just a year ago, that's predominantly print, I think we all recognize that it will evolve, and it will evolve quickly over time. There will be print products for a very, very long period of time. They are today, and they will be for a long period going forward, profitable businesses. They will not be as profitable as they were my last year in Dallas in 1998, where at just the Dallas Morning News alone, we ran a 37, almost 38% operating cash flow margin. Okay, that's a pretty strong business. And no one should for a moment think that we did that on the heels of just grinding down our employees and taking expenses out. We were winning Pulitzer Prizes. It was an extraordinary newspaper. But those days are over with. Those days have evolved away over the last 5 to 10 years, and they're not going to come back. But if you look at these businesses increasingly, set aside the journalistic enterprise for a moment, but look at them as you would a typical manufacturing or industrial business, where you're hoping to create a margin of 5 to 10%, and it can be a really, really nice business for many, many, many years in the future. We can do that. We can do that easily. The key is not paying, the sorts of multiples that this business traditionally attracted over what we now affectionately refer to as the golden age of newspapering, the last, up until 5 years ago, the preceding 25 years, where for a metro newspaper, that would come available, few and far between, you would see purchase price multiples in the range of 12 to 15 to 18 times. You obviously can't do that with a business that's going to generate a 5 to 10% operating margin on a sustained basis. But they can still be wonderful, wonderful business. So you have to buy them smart. And as Jim just described in pretty good detail, Jim and his group of fellow investors bought this business very, very smart. So first, a very quick, brief background, and I won't belabor it. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. Family moved to Southern California when my sister and I were still young. I was fortunate enough to go to Harvard University. I'm a first-generation American. Both of my parents are survivors of the Holocaust. I fell in love with newspapers, working at the Harvard Crimson for all 4 years. That's where I sort of learned the business. I ended up in Dallas, the Dallas Morning News. It was my only job out of college for 24 years. I spent the last 10 years as president and general manager and basically running that newspaper. We did have a very celebrated competitive battle there with the Dallas Times-Herald. Through most of those years, it was owned, and there's a certain amount of symmetry here I recognize, by the Times-Mirror Corporation. That obviously was then purchased by Tribune. I understand competitive newspaper markets really, really well. I thrive in them, to be honest with you. It's what gets me charged up and excited. Although, realistically, it's not just us versus them, okay? And anyone who loves newspapers, at the end of the day, doesn't want either to ever disappear. Our competition increasingly is less the Tribune, and it's much more all the other alternatives, not just for news, but for people's time. That's where the rubber meets the road today. We did start as a number 2 paper. We got much closer to the market and much more local, covering the needs and interests of readers in the Dallas metropolitan area than the Times-Herald ever did. We ended up prevailing in that competition. We did some extraordinary things after they closed and shut down, to ensure that the community of Dallas would still be well served by a major print vehicle. And so while in Dallas there's one newspaper, and I know many of you are probably thinking, well, aren't most markets going to gravitate towards one or fewer newspapers? I think, and I felt for a very long time, that Chicago is different because of the size of the market. Los Angeles can obviously support multiple newspapers. New York certainly can support multiple newspapers. I think Chicago can. And I think what aids it dramatically is, when you think about the Tribune, it reminds me of my old Dallas Morning News where I grew up. The Dallas Morning News is the establishment newspaper of record in North Texas. It's not the entire state of Texas. Just as the Tribune is the establishment newspaper of record in this region. It always has been, and it may well be for the foreseeable future. That was a formula and a business model that worked extremely well, as I referred to a moment ago, for many years. I think, unfortunately, today, and I know some of my competitiveness is going to come out, that also means in today's world kind of boring, because they carry that legacy. They carry that legacy. The Chicago Sun-Times, and it's something I've been talking about ever since I got here on this assignment to try to save the old company late last February, has been and continues to be the heart and soul of Chicago. Those are two very different positioned operations and businesses. And I think it's that differentiation and distinction that makes for two, hopefully, strong newspapers going forward. And I mean that. When the Times-Herald went out of business from a financial perspective, it was an extraordinary event. But for someone who loves newspapers, it was a very sad day. A voice was lost. And I don't think that's going to happen in Chicago for a good long while. I left Dallas about 11 years ago now. I was getting a little bored. The company was beginning to focus really more on broadcast than on newspaper. And I left to start my own newspaper company. Again, 10, 11 years ago, the idea of buying a metro newspaper was pretty much an impossible dream. They never came available, and when they did, they were going for these extraordinary multiples. So I started a company focused on small, rural, isolated newspapers. Communities of 25 to 30,000 that make for extraordinary businesses. They typically have, Brownwood, Texas, my largest newspaper in Texas, a town of 35,000, no print competition, there is no local TV, there's essentially no local radio, and if it is, it's country and western and some pop 40 station. And you are local news for people in that community. Those make for wonderful businesses, and they will for a very, very long time, which taught me the importance of local and local focus. And Jim referred to that, and he refers to it often, but it can't be repeated often enough. That is going to be the saving grace of what have been traditional metropolitan newspapers. Because I don't need to tell a single person in this room, you can get international and national news all sorts of places. But if you want local news about your local community, and I'm not just talking about the city of Chicago, I'm talking about Naperville, Aurora, the Pioneer Press communities, we provide that content. And so it's a matter of sizing a business economically to support today's economic realities for print publications. And that's essentially what we've just been through this past almost year at the Chicago Sun-Times. So I ran that company for about 10 years. It grew to 105 titles in 10 states. We sold the company to a media company out of Australia. I stayed on for about a year and a half. Things were getting a little boring there again. Once the US economy started beginning to soften in the fourth quarter of 2007, as dire as that looked to those of us living in the US, you can imagine what it looked like to a group of well-intentioned Australians living 7,000 or 8,000 miles away. So they quickly got cold feet, and it was an opportunity for me to step down. They're in the process of probably selling those assets now sometime soon to someone else. I was looking at investing with a couple of large investor groups that I've become familiar with at a couple of large metro papers, San Diego and Austin, Texas. It's all public record out there, so I'm not telling anything out of school. Principally because, well, I had been focusing on smaller newspapers and really understanding from a perspective that I never would have gotten had I stayed in Dallas, the core essence of how these newspapers and news organizations operate, and what elements are important, and what elements are just bureaucracy that grew up over a number of years, which is a waste of everybody's time. I was sort of excited about getting back into metro newspapers, because I thought they could still be, as I mentioned a moment ago, wonderful businesses if you think about them a little differently and forget about the golden age of newspapering and running margins of 25 or 30%. So I was contacted by 2 or 3 of the large shareholders of the old Sun-Times Media Group who had grown dissatisfied with the previous board. I thought it was going to be, you know, an assignment where I'd come to Chicago 4 times a year for a board meeting and help a very well-intentioned group of employees sort of work through their current challenges. As it turns out, those investors didn't have a clue how dire the financial circumstances were. When they called me, they said, we've got $100 million in the bank and no debt. Well, as it turns out, 60 million plus of that 100 million is pension money in Canada, sitting there for the benefit of former Hollinger, current CanWest employees at newspapers in Canada. And obviously those dollars are never going to come to the US to help a Chicago organization. So the financial situation was much more dire than we had anticipated. I was asked to serve as chairman. Cyrus, he and I, you know, but for the obvious circumstances, I think would have become very dear friends. He's a wonderful fellow. I know many of you know him and know him well. Decided to resign, and so I took on the role of interim chairman. And then we began this process that Jim has referred to from sort of his end of the tunnel. From our end of the tunnel, it was filing for bankruptcy, restructuring the business in a very, very dramatic fashion. And bankruptcy is a beautiful thing because it allows you to do that much more quickly and much more effectively and efficiently than would otherwise be the case. One of the great strengths I discovered at this organization, and I'm familiar with metro papers all over the country, was the quality of our people. This is a group of employees, 1,800 employees, who, going back to Conrad Blount and the bad guys, and since then, so over the last 8 to 10 years, have been through a lot. It was very easy for me to come in and say, you know what, let's set all those legacy issues that have totally preoccupied this business aside, and let's focus on what we enjoy doing most, and that's publishing great newspapers and great websites. And so it is a cultural change that is underway at our place. And it's also a change of perspective on the marketplace. Instead of being the perennial sort of beaten down number 2, I can tell you right now that from a marketing perspective, from a pricing perspective and circulation and advertising, from what we're doing with our news and editorial product, the other guys reacting to us on almost a daily basis. That's the only way I know how to run a business. And it will continue. It will continue. Even when they get out of bankruptcy, it will continue because we have a new emerging culture at the Sun-Times. And we are going to engage this community in a level of civic discourse and debate on the key issues of the day, in addition to reporting the local news with a level of credibility and fact that no one else can provide. No one has the coverage in this community that we do. The Tribune can't hire enough people to match it. And obviously, as strong a work as is done by local magazines, TV stations, radio stations, etc., we all know that from a news and content perspective, they typically, not always, but typically, look to the local print products and what we're publishing every morning to set their news budgets. That's okay. Once in a while, they even give us credit for that. And that's how it works. So in terms of going forward, it is a new organization. It's a fresh organization. We have a new capital structure. So in addition to running the company through bankruptcy, negotiating with our 16 labor unions, imposing some pretty severe and dramatic changes on all of our employees. There's not an employee out of our 1,800 who hasn't taken a very, very significant sacrifice of some form or fashion. That's just a simple truth. The good news in that is we've got 1,800 employees who understood that once it was explained to them, and one by one, each in their own way, stepped back up to the bar and said, yeah, I will do this because I believe in this enterprise and I believe where we can go. So we've got some wonderful assets and some wonderful momentum working behind us. At the same time, on a parallel path, the only way we were going to save this enterprise, just filing bankruptcy was not going to do it unless we had enough of our own cash to catch up with the restructuring activities we were taking to sustain ourselves going forward. And we knew pretty quickly, back in late February and March, we did not. And so we had to run a sale process. Even in this day and age of it being very difficult for media companies to transact anything. The reason your typical media company that today is already in bankruptcy and coming out of bankruptcy is now owned 90 to 95% or more by their senior lenders, by the banks. JP Morgan, within 6 months or so, will be the largest newspaper publisher in America. It's because there's no market for these properties, and that's not going to return anytime soon. So we had a great challenge, but we believe we can be successful by creating a vision of what this institution could be and could represent going forward, by the opportunity of selling in print and online what we do and how we do it with our local, credible content, and we were successful, okay? I never doubted for a single day that we would be successful. That may be less my career of buying and selling a lot of newspapers over the years, but also really believing in these businesses. They are changing quickly, but I think smart, intelligent people working together as a team with the new forward-looking culture can connect those dots and create a wonderful business that sustains the journalism that is the core of what we do. And so Jim referred to it, but as I introduce John Barron, and then we'll take whatever questions you all have. One of the things I noticed in looking at the organization is that the news operation, we are a news company, simply was not as visible and as evident up high in the senior ranks of the organization. I had never been involved in a newspaper publishing company where that was not the case. We also needed to elevate the role of interactive and create a platform so it's not just an afterthought, yeah, it's something we need to do. It needs to be there at the highest, most senior levels of the company. And so, end of last week, we announced some things. Principal was John Barron, while he will continue in his role as publisher of the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper, and he'll continue in his role as publisher of the Pioneer Press group of weekly newspapers. Will also take on the role as group publisher, so he will work with our other daily publishers, the other 7, and the other weekly products. But he is also our senior vice president for news and editorial. So it was something we felt really, really good about, and we think it sends a wonderful signal to the community, to our employees, to every one of our newsrooms, and to all the constituents involved. So with that, John, I'll ask you to come up.
While John's on his working his way up here, in addition to everything, I know Jay wanted me to mention this, that he is a proud alumnus of Marquette University, a true Marquette warrior. Come on up here, John. I know Golden Eagle, Paul. And I'd also like to ask Paul Green, our premier moderator, to come up here because you're going to handle the questions and answers. And everyone knows Paul, the Arthur Rubloff professor at Roosevelt University. And 7:15 tomorrow morning, WGN Radio, his first of his 3 spots. Come on up here, Paul.
Thanks for coming to our coming out party. I just wanted to say that there's been no finer friend of the Sun-Times over the years than both Jay Doherty as an individual and the City Club as a group, and we thank you guys for hosting us. To those of you who've been following the Sun-Times story over all these years, and especially over the last couple of months, I say that there is no shame in being totally confused. In the 15 years that I've been at the paper, I've had more than a few chances to share my confusion with many of you. However, after the recent sale of the company to Mr. Tyree, after that was completed, my teenage daughter, who had also been confused, finally asked me to explain it all to her. What did this new development mean? It's a really good question, and I could have given her a very complicated answer. But I thought for a minute, and I finally said, "There's going to be a Christmas, honey. We're going to be here." And that's all really that she and you really need to know. Sometimes media has made it. We're going to be here for Christmas and a good long time after that. Mr. Tyree talks in decades, and that's all thanks to the work of the men you just heard from. Jim Tyree is one of the smartest businessmen in the country. You can quote me on that, and I wish you would frequently. He saw what we on the inside saw, which was a vibrant company that had accomplished about 10 years worth of work over the last 2 years. He saw a company that continues to be uniquely poised to serve the growing appetite for local news. He saw a company that contains multitudes, from the big Chicago Sun-Times to our suburban dailies, which literally ring the metropolitan area, to all the excellent Pioneer Press newspapers, which hold a weekly mirror up to the 39 communities they cover, from Hinsdale to Oak Park to Evanston, Lake Forest, all the way up to the Wisconsin border. Thank you, Jim Tyree, for making what is going to turn out to be one of the smartest bets this side of Sportsman's Park. Jeremy Halbreich landed in our midst in February. He appears to be a mild-mannered, smiling Texan, and he is. But in a few short months, he also emerged as a man of steel, engineering a repositioning of our company to make it ready for a sale. And then he helped shepherd us and our employees through a series of out-and-out miracles that allowed us to make it into the hands of Mr. Tyree and his investor group. What a happy ending, and we love the way it has turned out. Back in the early spring, when we entered bankruptcy, the possible outcomes for us ranged from the grim to the positively apocalyptic. But now, here we are, with just about the best balance sheet of any newspaper company in the country. Through it all, those of us on the inside had faith that we weren't going to go away. We knew that the Sun-Times was way too important to Chicago to fold up. Over the summer, when our fate was still undetermined, I ran into people every single day who desperately asked me what they were going to do without the Sun-Times. Nobody seemed to worry about what was going to happen to me, but boy, were they concerned about the Sun-Times and by extension all of our sister papers. All of you here at the City Club already know how important it is that the Sun-Times now has this new life. I don't have to tell you what's in it for you, but I will anyway. You here are among the most engaged in what's happening with Chicago, and now you know we'll continue to be right there with you, providing, as always, a crib sheet on the big 3 Ps. Politicians, public policy, and A.J. Brzezinski. You know the value of strong independent editorial voices and what they add to the public square. Chicago is too big, too proud, and too important to only have one paper telling its story. You know that no one covers the city better than the Sun-Times. You know that our editor-in-chief, Don Hayner, is a newsman's newsman whose soul has been interchangeable with the soul of the Sun-Times for the last 27 years. You know that there's no stronger set of columnists anywhere in the country than those that we've corralled at the Sun-Times. From Michael Sneed and Roger Ebert to Carol Marine, Richard Roper, Mary Mitchell, Mark Brown, Rick Tellender, Bill Zwecker, Steve Huntley, Lynn Sweet, and the irrepressible Stella Foster. What a lineup. And Mike Sneed, you noticed I started with you. Was one. You all know that there is no better sports section in town. In fact, it has been said that the four most important jobs in Chicago are mayor, chief of police, the cardinal, and the sports editor of the Chicago Sun-Times. Not necessarily in that order. And we're delighted that longtime columnist and baseball writer Chris DeLuca just assumed that title last week. You know that there's no better set of watchdogs than those spearheaded by the city's best investigative reporter Tim Novak. And over at City Hall, I pity anyone who has to deal with our legendary reporter Fran Spielman. From the mayor right down to the competition, our readers get the benefit of her work. We have been at the Sun-Times, and you can count on us to continue to be quick, nimble, feisty, fun, gritty, unself-conscious, and real. Finally, again, thanks for all of your continued support in this room. Thanks to Michael Simon and the gang at Mesereau, to our president and COO, Rick Circumer, to our senior VP of advertising, Barb Swanson, to our vice president of circulation, Courtney Price, and especially to Jeremy and Jim. Thanks to all of their work, you can count on us to keep coming out every day. Merry Christmas, one and all. We'll see you tomorrow and into the new year.
Well, now it's question time. Instead of having these guys, give you the story, not a bad story, but on you, right, Bush, we have the official question. I have one already. Tweed will get it. No, this is not from Bruce Dole, just in case you were wondering. I would assume, I'm not coming here as often as I used to, so I have to get a lot out. I assume none of you are working on a presidential biography? Okay.
For the club, or you mean that?
That's a Conrad Black joke.
I just thought I'd throw that out, and I should have done. All right.
Never funny.
So many great lines. All right, from Dave Cohn, from the Union League Club. What are your thoughts on the recent launched Chicago News Cooperative, which says it will provide the investigative journalism needed for our region? Don't all jump up at once. Just
I'll be happy to. I think if you look around the country, there's a lot of frustration, well-founded frustration in the fact that many, if not most, newspapers have cut back their resources. And so there's less of that work being done, not just in Chicago, but everywhere. And so you're beginning to see the beginnings of some very entrepreneurial responses to that. Some of it exclusively online, some of it a hybrid, which is what I guess the one here might best be, and some in print. There's been no demonstrated economic model for it yet. The group here locally seems to be almost a vendetta against the Tribune, which I think is unfortunate. It's being funded by lots of foundation money, which I think is the right place for foundations to be placing their bets, to try to serve as an entrepreneurial incubator, if you will. But at the end of the day, as we all know, foundation money runs out. They put their funds elsewhere. Hopefully their money doesn't run out, but they'll put their grants elsewhere. And so it still begs the question, where's the business model there? We're not particularly concerned about it. It's not necessarily targeting our advertisers, our readers, more so at the Tribune, but I still don't think it's particularly significant. I think it will add to some of the discourse, which is good. I'll go ahead and tell you, I'm not at all impressed with the first couple of showings. You know, the Friday one that was much ballyhooed had basically 2 6-month-old stories and not much else. I hope it gets a lot better. It needs to. But it does bring more to the table, and that's important. It's good for all of us. If it represents competition, that's good for us. It will cause us to do more and better. It will cause us to redouble our efforts as a local watchdog and what we do at City Hall and other local and regional institutions. So it's an interesting start. Chicago's not the only place this is going on, and we'll see how it evolves. John, any more on that?
you know, more jobs for journalists. That's always good. They are on a nonprofit model, and boy, we've been there, and that's not a good thing to be. So you know, the proof will be in the pudding. Like Jeremy says, the first two outings on Friday and Sunday. I mean, every journalist, everybody interested in journalism and writing in Chicago paid a lot of attention to that. And it was a little disappointing out of the box, and I'm sure it will get better. But what it means to us, we're not that concerned about it. What it means for the New York Times, I hope it makes the New York Times in Chicago get better.
Okay, by the way, now that I'm back, remember, clarity, neatness really count to get your questions asked. Just so we're clear on that. Anne Marie St. Germain from the Board of Governors, our Board of Governors. What are some of the upcoming changes readers can expect as the Chicago Sun-Times evolves into a new future, and how will print and online content relate to the future? We don't want any of that past stuff, we want the future stuff.
Right. Well, we tried to refer to that earlier. You're going to be seeing more and more online. In our case, we need to make some long overdue, long postponed needed capital investments to put us on a platform to do that efficiently and effectively. The systems we're operating under now, both on the news and the business side, are arguably embarrassing, so I'm not even going to go into it. But we will be very aggressive in leading the news agenda in this city, and in all parts of this city, both in print and online. And increasingly, it's not going to be sort of one or the other. We already have editors who will think both, and we will continue to evolve that meshing, if you will, increasingly. It will include video. We've got flexibility and opportunities in front of us with our new organization. It was part of the concessions we were able to gain from the guilds, quite frankly. Not just because of the dire economic circumstances we were facing, but because I believe they truly, in their heart of hearts, believe in this vision and in this opportunity that we can take advantage of. So day to day, you know, we're not going to be introducing dramatic new sections and reformatting the paper and changing the type style and the type size or things like that. But it's really going to be more about the content and how we deploy it. One of the things the Sun-Times has always benefited from was this local focus, and we're going to continue to drive that home.
Okay, this is from Christy Hefner. Christy, there's a word here, you may have to help me out, you know, the old eyes. Will you participate with Steve Brill? I assume he's not on any watch list, is he? With Steve Brill, Journalism Online, both the micro payment and the subscription aspects. I hope that makes sense to one of you guys.
It makes perfect sense.
Perfect, good. He always does.
And so the background, and obviously Christy's a media insider, thank you very much. There's an organization that was formed recently by Steve Brill, who's a very successful magazine publisher, American Lawyer Magazine and all the spin-offs, Gordon Krovitz, who's former Wall Street Journal, and Leo Hendry, who was involved with TCI Cable for many, many years and other media investments, whereby they, in effect, have developed the infrastructure and the technology for traditional print publications, newspapers and others, to put their content behind a paywall or to charge readers on sort of a metering basis on a variety of different bases for the content. And what they've said is they welcome working with any and all comers to test this model and see if maybe newspapers can't generate some revenue streams. Direct answer to the question, we have not spoken with them yet. I mean, we've called their folks and had some preliminary conversations. But clearly, while we were in bankruptcy up until 4 weeks ago, we were in no position to make those sorts of longer-term commitments. We've actually done a little bit of paywall experimenting on our own, not telling anybody. We generated 200 paid subscriptions from people around the country. It's not enough money for anybody to worry about. I've just spent in these last 7 seconds all the money that we generated by doing that. But we're going to test all that. Here's my, more importantly I hope, operating philosophy on paywalls, paid content, metering for content. There is a role for it. Any print publication that has exclusive content of any form, which they do and they do alone very uniquely, should consider it and needs to consider it. It will not be the panacea. It will not be what saves traditional print publications. There will not be enough money there, and I think most of the industry is coming around to understanding that. But there will be a steady, consistent revenue flow. It will be a new line, a new channel of revenue, which in combination with lots of others will sustain these businesses going forward. So yeah, we're going to be very aggressive in looking at those things. We are not a technology company, and I think one of the areas where newspapers, I can't speak for magazines, but certainly most traditional metropolitan newspapers came out of a school, of my old school in Dallas, where we were running, I told you, operating margins of 35 to 40%. And when you run a business like that, I'm here to tell you, you don't need anybody's help. You think you can do everything yourself. And so among the reasons print newspapers have been so slow to adapt and gravitate or even deal with the internet is they just thought, you know, if we have to create it ourselves someday, we'll do it ourselves. Can't do that anymore. We have local content that no one else has. That's our franchise. That's our trading value, if you will. There are technology companies who do technology a whole lot better than we ever will. We have no need to go out and hire a room of 20 computer programmers to write code to come up with some new application. But we need to go out very aggressively, and we are already doing that today, to partner with those technology companies to utilize their technology around our content and bring it to the marketplace.
You know, it's interesting though that on question 3 or 4 here, we had a question about paying for content. And maybe a year and a half ago, that wouldn't have come up at all. I mean, we have all been on the internet since 94, 95. There really hasn't been any talk about paid content outside of you know, Wall Street Journal and publications like that. Now, it is very much a part of the conversation and very much, I think, part of the awareness of the audiences out there. And I don't think that we've reached a consensus in our own place or that there's any consensus in the industry as to where that's going to go. But it definitely is being talked about, and something's going to brew out there. What the model's going to be, we all have to probably eventually agree on something. We all can't be going off in our own directions. If we do agree on something, we will inevitably go through a Betamax VHS period where we try to figure out which method is going to work, and it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch probably over the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay, this is from Biff Ruttenberg. I know it's an alias. What will drive circulation to levels that will produce adequate advertising revenue? Well, you've covered most of that. Why don't you give a quick answer on that one? Besides John doing stand-up. That was pretty good.
Well, clearly it's headed in the wrong direction, not only in Chicago at both newspapers, but everywhere in the country. And the reason it is people are going increasingly digital. And so, yeah, while we are always interested in increasing the readership of our newspapers, and we believe we will going forward, it's not going to be by huge amounts, but we believe we will because we'll have the content to do that. We also have to be very, very cognizant and sanguine about the fact that people will continue to go increasingly digital, and we need to be there for them. And so whether it's readership online as opposed to readership in print, I have no hesitation telling you right now, we will grow our readership, and thanks to Barb and her team. And you know, while Jim referred to Barb as sort of Barb and Courtney both as our 2 revenue people, make no bones about it, we all work for the 2 of them. Okay? We all are there to support what they do every day. We will be able to position these properties to take advantage of those eyeballs. You know, you can't always create a market and force it to do something it doesn't otherwise want to do on its own. What you need to do is understand your market and be there for them, and to provide the things that they are looking for. And so whether it's in print or online, whether it's for our advertisers in print or online, we need to be providing that service.
All right.